She she is the author of a beautiful book called Contemplative Life: Discovering Our Path into the Heart of God. When we do contemplation, we the goal is to live it, is to live contemplation. And Julie is an expert in that, and we're just so graced that she joined us, getting up early this morning to present. Julie, you're on.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Give me just a minute here. I'm going to put my slides up. There we go. Okay, so good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to be with you for this Advent Retreat Day. And, I was with you during Advent last year, and I also see some familiar faces, which is really nice. Terry and the gang who spent about 18 months working together through my book, which I think was a really good experience for them. So, anyway, last year we talked about interior silence, which is a topic that I love. And as I was thinking about what to talk about this year, and um, since we call the Christmas season the season of light, I thought it might be appropriate to start with some thoughts on darkness, because without darkness, there can be no light, right? And just to tell you that this is a topic that I've been thinking about for a very long time, like probably about 20 years or so. And this is the first time that I've given this topic voice. So I already asked Terry to pray for me, so I'll ask the rest of you, please pray for me. I think I'm going to probably mess up the schedule a little bit too, because I realized after I created this talk, this probably was enough content for like a weekend retreat. And so we'll see how we do. Anyway, most of us think of darkness as related to something bad or maybe even sinister. But most of the so called darkness that we experience in life is really a doorway into the light. And so I hope that some of these thoughts will encourage you on your spiritual journey and offer you some reflections during this Advent season as well. One of the things that I love about this picture for my theme of embracing darkness is that for me, it denotes a doorway into the unknown, where I think the contemplative path ultimately leads us. I loved that little prayer that Katie started centering prayer with this morning that talked about this kind of path into the mystery of God. So anyway, these are the topics that I'll be covering today. And this morning, we'll cover the first three: depression, the false self, and our shadow, which Father Thomas sometimes refers to as the dark side of our personality. And then this afternoon, we'll talk about the dark night of the soul, and then how the light shines in the darkness. Okay. So I want to start today with where it all started. This is a reading from Genesis. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was without form or shape, with darkness over the abyss, and a mighty wind sweeping over the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good. God then separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. So we see here that that the world started in darkness until God said, "Let there be light." And I think that's a beautiful metaphor for the coming of the light of the world that we anticipate during Advent. In this little book that Thomas Keating wrote many years ago, back in the 80s, he explores the liturgical year. And this is what he had to say about Advent that I think is relevant to our topic. He says the Christmas Epiphany mystery is the celebration of the transmission of divine light. The liturgical year begins with Advent, a period of intense preparation to understand and accept the three comings of Christ. The first is his historical coming in human weakness and the manifestation of his divinity to the world. The second is his spiritual coming in our inmost being through the liturgical celebration of the Christmas Epiphany mystery. The third is his final coming at the end of time in his glorified humanity. So we're at the beginning of the celebration of the transmission of divine light. And Father Thomas never talked about divine light as being only a quality that's transmitted by Christ. So notice that he says the second coming of Christ is in our inmost being. So we are all capable of transmitting divine light. But the human condition gets in the way of that transmission. And so during this season of Christmas, we're celebrating the incarnation. But it's not just the incarnation as the embodiment of Christ in the person of Jesus. We are also celebrating the embodiment of Christ in each one of us. So try to remember too that it's a journey, and there are many signposts along the way to guide us. And with signposts, we can always choose to follow them or go a different way, right? And so it is along the way with our contemplative journey. And I think the only thing that God ever asks of us is to consent. The signposts lead us to healing and transformation if we consent. So it's always a choice. And I think the way we awaken to who we are is by being aware of our choices. So in other words, bringing into consciousness, first, the fact that we are choosing, and second, noticing what we are choosing. Okay. One of the things that attracted me so strongly to Thomas Keating's teaching is the way that he interwove the practicality of psychology with the mystery of spirituality. He says in Invitation to Love, "It is my conviction that the language of psychology is an essential vehicle in our time to explain the healing of the unconscious effected during the dark nights which John of the Cross describes. For one thing, it's a language that is better understood than the traditional language of spiritual theology, at least in the Western world. It also provides a more comprehensive understanding of the psychological dynamics which grace has to contend with in the healing and transforming process." So he goes on to talk about how contemplative prayer is a tool for confronting our struggle with unconscious motivation. And this is what prepares us for a deepening relationship with God and leads to divine union. So today we'll be looking at both the psychological and spiritual aspects of the human condition. Teresa of Avila says that the path to knowing God is that of self-knowledge. So, what we're talking about today is taking steps along the path to self knowledge. So, when we consent to God's presence and action within, we're consenting to God bringing us closer through the darkness. And along the way, we're also building trust in God that God is with us. Okay. The reason that I like to use this quote from Martin Laird is so that when you experience what is inevitable in life, especially when we start down the path of contemplative practice, rather than deny that we may go through some painful times on this journey, it's more helpful, I think, to accept it as part of the journey, all for our good, for the deepening of our relationship with God, and how we treat those whom we encounter in daily life. So Laird says, we do not journey far along the spiritual path before we get some sense of the wound of the human condition. And this is precisely why not a few abandon a contemplative practice like meditation as soon as it begins to expose this wound. They move on instead to some spiritual entertainment that will maintain distraction. So when I was talking about signposts earlier, I think the first one we come across is when the wound of the human condition starts to be exposed. And we can choose to look more deeply into the wound or maintain some sort of distraction. So I would ask you to hold what I just said lightly, because when the wound is first exposed is not the only time when we will be faced with a choice of looking more deeply or maintaining some sort of distraction. So God remains with us wherever we are, and we will surely choose distraction over and over again. And that, that's not a reason to throw out the whole project, okay? Oops. So I would like you for a minute to think of some of the things that you struggle with in your daily life. Maybe it's having an aversion to conflict, or you have a tendency to fly off the handle if you get angry, or maybe you have a teenager who won't talk to you anymore, or a coworker who's driving you up the wall. So, what is it that is present in your daily life that you struggle with? Okay. And then let's listen to what Martin Laird says about struggle. He says, for some reason, we think that spiritual progress is marked by lack of struggle in life. Spiritual progress is learning to confront struggle in a new way so that we don't struggle with the fact that life is fraught with struggle. But the practice of contemplation will expose us to many things we would rather not see but need to see if we are going to grow. Even something as potentially debilitating as depression or obsessive compulsive behavior finds healing salve in the practice of contemplation. So while we may think that the spiritual journey will relieve us from struggles in daily life, we can rest assured that it does not. But as Laird says, learning to confront our struggles can help us to struggle less with the fact that life is fraught with struggle. That sentence makes me laugh, but I think he's right. It's true. So how does this happen? And I think this is a really helpful model. If you followed much of Thomas Keating's teaching, you've likely heard him talk about the spiral model. When it applies to our spiritual journey, we are not on a linear path. It's more of a circular path, the movement of which brings us deeper. So we will likely come around again to what feels like the same old struggle. And while it might be the same old struggle, we're not the same. So we have new experiences, new tools for dealing with struggles, and a deeper relationship with God. So this is the new way that I think Laird is talking about. Ultimately, we come to realize that these struggles no longer have the same power over us that they once had. I made this little slide because I couldn't help but think of some of the struggles that Jesus had in his life that's throughout scripture, throughout the gospels. And so I just offered this slide as some examples of his struggles that you could do Lectio Divina with if you wanted to. But when Laird was talking about struggle, he was trying to offer encouragement that contemplative practice can be a healing salve, even for something as potentially debilitating as depression. So, first, he says contemplative practice can deepen and expand endlessly, even in the midst of intense emotional struggle, such as depression and anxiety. And, we probably all know that depression is so prevalent in our culture today, often accompanied by anxiety. And, I think it's also affecting more younger people since, especially the ones that went through the pandemic with the rest of us. Many of us experience periods of depression, whether it be a clinical depression or a reactive or situational depression that follows a tragic life event, maybe the loss of a loved one, an accident, something like that. But because depression comes with a depletion of energy and physical exhaustion, it may feel like too much to continue with any kind of contemplative practice. Laird goes on to say, insofar as we discover the life that is revealed on the contemplative path, we will encounter at some point the dark side of the emotions. Living through, praying in the midst of, and ultimately seeing through our emotions is crucial to learning what this ordeal has to teach. So most of the time, we want to avoid darkness as much as we can. But Father Thomas said to me one time that depression doesn't interfere with the prayer. It was a way of encouraging me to persevere and learn what it had to teach me. So we don't do the prayer to rid ourselves of depression or the dark side of our emotions, but we will benefit from what we call the divine therapy. And this doesn't mean that we don't seek whatever kind of help we need. Therapy, medication, 12-step recovery, or, any other treatment modality that's helpful. We are simply consenting to the divine therapy as well. It can help us see the relationship between our mood and the negative thoughts and commentaries and afflictive emotions that get triggered, and how that creates a loop that reinforces our depressive mood. Divine therapy can help us recognize that God is with us in whatever we're experiencing, and this may start to loosen the grip of depression. It can also help us realize that there is something within us, the divine indwelling and our true self, that's untouched by depression. So Laird finishes with, our emotions are transparent to the light that grounds them. Whether our emotions are dark and crippling or enlivening, light shines within darkness and light shines within light. We simply need to look into a radically decluttered mind and see this light of awareness for ourselves. Remember what Martin Laird said about the wound of the human condition. And I love both of these versions of this idea. Some say that Leonard Cohen was inspired by Rumi. In any case, the wound or the crack, or however else we might describe darkness, is what opens us to the light. Rumi says, stay with it. The wound is the place where the light enters you. And Cohen says, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So I want to talk about the human condition so we have a better idea of what we're dealing with. And first, let's look at what Thomas Keating has to say to us about some of life's struggles. He says, the gospel calls us forth to full responsibility for our emotional life. We tend to blame other people or situations for the turmoil we experience. In actual fact, upsetting emotions prove beyond any doubt that the problem is in us. If we do not assume responsibility for our emotional programs on the unconscious level and take measures to change them, we'll be influenced by them to the end of our life. And then Carl Jung, who helped us, I think, to really understand, he was a psychiatrist, of course, understand a lot more about the unconscious and the shadow that we'll be talking about. He says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And if we're going to take full responsibility, excuse me, for our emotional life, we have to bring into awareness or consciousness why we aren't taking full responsibility. And I'll tell you, from the first time I started writing my book on contemplative life, I have sort of been marinating in this quote from Father Thomas, trying to actualize it in my life. That's how important I think it is to our growth in discovering who we were created to be. I also believe that if we don't recognize what both of these people are saying, that we will feel powerless and think this is just the way it is. That's what fate is, right? So we'll start by looking at the false self system and its impact on the human condition. I don't know if you've ever seen this slide before, but you're probably, most of you, I hope, are familiar with Thomas Keating's teaching on the human condition and the development of the false self system that starts in early childhood. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing the basics, but I like this model, which I think simplifies this teaching on the false self system. So, and I'm hoping you can see my little arrow on the slide. The three energy centers are power and control, esteem and affection, and security and survival. And these start out as instinctual needs that we do our best to meet. Oops, sorry, I don't know how that happens. We do our best to meet these needs in early childhood, okay? And we usually end up perceiving that our needs are unmet. And, sometimes that's true and sometimes that's a perception. But the unmet needs linger in our unconscious. And we're still trying to meet them as adults with attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are often irrational and sometimes infantile and are usually overreactions. So the other thing that affects our daily life as adults is our cultural conditioning, which also primarily is in the unconscious. This part down here in the darker area is the unconscious. So we develop prepackaged values from our social groups. So that would be our family, our peers, church, school, the city, neighborhood we live in, our country. And these prepackaged values also shape our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, especially when we over identify with them. So, all of that is what's sort of teeming in our unconscious and become our emotional programming. And when we're talking about the false self system and the human condition, we say that these are our emotional programs for happiness. And when something becomes programmed into the unconscious, we don't really think about it anymore. It becomes automatic. This is what's in our consciousness. This is where we live our daily life. So we all have desires, but when our desires are motivated by these hidden values, which are the things that are in the unconscious, these unconscious unmet needs cannot, sorry, I don't know what I'm doing. I click on something and the slide moves forward. Anyway, so these unconscious unmet needs cannot possibly be met in our adult lives, and we start to cling to them. And that's what we call the attachments and aversions. So our desires become an attachment or an aversion. And now daily life presents us with a triggering event, okay? And then we'll have an irrational emotional reaction. The afflictive emotions that we experience set off a cascade of commentaries, turmoil, interior dialogue, and that puts us in a box that we can't get out of. And that in turn reinforces what's going on in the unconscious and any unresolved values that we identify with are reinforce our desire. And you can see how this is a cycle that we can get caught in. So here's another way of looking at what we just talked about. And so take this in for a moment. So you can see these little words this is what's in the unconscious: the woundedness, perceptions, energy centers, beliefs, defenses, our cultural conditioning. These are the things that are often in control until we realize they're in control and we take measures to dismantle them. And you can see the interaction between a triggering event in daily life and really whether it sets off afflictive emotions or commentaries doesn't matter, because it will all come into play if we're triggered or if our buttons are pushed in some way. Now, most feelings, even if they're uncomfortable, if they're appropriate to the event or circumstance, they'll dissipate with time, and they don't start this cascade of emotions and commentaries that seem to take over. So when you have a cascade, that's when you can tell something from the unconscious has been triggered. So how do we take measures to dismantle them? I would suggest with contemplative practices. And so these are probably the most common practices taught by contemplative outreach. And I'm assuming most of you are familiar with them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I just want to touch on them as a reminder of how they can help us. So in the welcoming prayer, there's 3 movements here. And these 3 movements of this prayer can help us have a healthier response to our emotional programs for happiness when they get triggered, okay? So first, we acknowledge that we've been triggered by staying with the feelings rather than resisting or suppressing them. And then we invite God into whatever we're experiencing. And then we let go of our attachment, which can start to heal these attachments and allow us the freedom to respond rather than react to whatever happened. And then Lectio Divina helps us to learn the values of the gospel and what they are saying to us in our lives today. And this is a practice that I think can start to dismantle the programs for happiness by changing our motivation from the unconscious values to our conscious choice. The active prayer can help to turn off obsessive thinking. So that's those commentaries and that internal dialogue that can be so troublesome. And it's because this can give our minds something else to focus on. So our regular practice of centering prayer raises our awareness of God in our daily life until something triggers our emotional programs. These practices can help to give our mind something else to do besides engage with the afflictive emotions or that endless interior dialogue. So now I want to talk a little bit about our shadow. And this is what I think Father Thomas was referring to when he would talk about the dark side of our personality. But, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I also appeal to your wisdom about this. I'm thinking that the shadow and the false self are the same thing. And so, you can see what you think about that as we go on and talk about this. So some of the characteristics of the shadow. So it's basically unconscious beliefs that we hold about ourselves that we picked up in early life. And usually, although we may have huge amounts of evidence to the contrary, we still believe these things about ourselves. And so these are the things about ourselves that are not true, but we believe them. It's where many of our commentaries come from, either in the voice of someone else in our heads, or it's our own voice. Things like, I'm unworthy, I'm inadequate, I'm broken, I'm dumb, I'm not enough. And then we feel shame about it. And we might say things like, I don't deserve this or that. Second, the shadow represents parts of ourselves that are the hardest to acknowledge or reconcile. So they're parts that we hide out of fear of rejection, criticism, judgment, betrayal. And again, because the shadow is largely coming from the unconscious, we're not likely to be consciously aware that we're keeping them hidden, okay? The shadow can be the parts of us that feel misunderstood, wounded, rejected, or even abandoned. It's often the things that we project onto others because we don't see them in ourselves. So we might find ourselves saying things like, she's so dramatic and is always gossiping about everything, or he can never be direct and say what's really on his mind, or why are you being so defensive? And when we find things to criticize in others, we really should look at whether we have that trait or behavior because we don't like it in someone else. We can recognize it sometimes in ourselves, but we don't want to admit it. Some of the things that might be in our shadow could be unresolved conflict, maybe some unlived desires or passions that we have, needs that we have that if we don't feel worthy, we deny them. Could be insecurities and judgments, quick temper, acting like a victim. Could be the biases and prejudices that we don't know we have and can't admit that we have, okay? So maybe you can see the similarities with what we say about the false self. And we might also think of it as what Martin Laird referred to as our wounded self. So why do we want to look at this? There is deepening taking place as we are exposed to things within ourselves that we would rather not see but need to see. And this contributes to our humbling self-knowledge that we talked about earlier. And with the divine therapy at work, we're experiencing an inflow of light into our awareness. So allowing that light in starts the process of healing the shadow. So we're not trying to get rid of it. This is about getting to know it by really delving into the unconscious and making it conscious. And while this is a healing process, it can also be painful. These are the parts of us that are hardest to acknowledge and reconcile, as I said. It's the parts that we hide out of some deep-rooted fear that we have. And so some of the steps that we can take to reveal and heal the shadow is becoming aware that we're resisting letting this part of us be seen. So the first step would be to stop resisting and acknowledge that we have a shadow self, a darker side of ourselves that needs the light of love. Okay? And we do this by watching ourselves. And I have a little practice I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes that can help with this. Part of it is bringing more awareness to our shadow, is to also start to recognize the inner voice that that may be criticizing us, belittling us, making us feel alone or not good enough. But it could also be a voice that is calling forth a self-righteousness or an arrogance or a pridefulness, which, if we admit that, can be a very humbling experience. The next part is to discern our values or beliefs, because some of what's in our shadow, as we talked about, comes from our cultural conditioning. And we may be behaving in daily life in ways that are contrary to what we value in our heart of hearts. And so by discerning our values and discarding those that don't resonate with our conscience can be a healing process. Another part is what we use in the welcoming prayer when we welcome God into whatever we're experiencing as our shadow, and that starts to come to light. So again, stop resisting and inviting God into what we're experiencing. The acceptance of the truth about ourselves can help us to integrate all parts of ourselves so that we can become whole. So embracing the shadow is really about embracing what is. And then you can decide what to do about it. Okay? The more that you explore your shadow, the more your inner light shines. So I've always been I've been thinking again about this particular quote from Marianne Williamson. For some reason, it got attributed a long time ago to Nelson Mandela, but it's in one of her books. She says, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us." So the shadow doesn't just include negative parts of ourselves. It also includes the positive, our gifts, our unlived potential, our hidden potential, our true self. So we could be denying or repressing our creativity, our wisdom, our charisma, our confidence. And we may be able to see our golden shadow by looking at what I talked about earlier, the things that maybe we project on to other people that we admire. You know, maybe we see in them their brilliance, their creativity, their compassion for others. These may be traits that we have as well. The gold is our unique strengths, our gifts, and our talents, and our passions. In reclaiming or claiming our gold is taking responsibility for our gifts and our capabilities. It might be easier to keep our light hidden because that's what we've always done and it's familiar. But when we do that, we're not living to our potential. We're not living life as the person that God created us to be. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 5. You are the light of the world. A city set on a mountain cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and then put it under a bushel basket. It's set on a lampstand where it can give light to all in the house. Just so your light must shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your heavenly Father. So these are a few simple practices that I've come across that I think can help us live daily life if we consider being more intentional in being present in daily life and in our interactions with others. This first one, Martin Laird says that watchfulness is an ancient contemplative practice that's also called vigilance, okay? And watchfulness is largely about awareness, about a non-judgmental awareness. So it's not to project or blame, but it's more just to notice. And this is a practice that can help us move from being a victim to other people and circumstances and events in our life to being a witness. So it's not that what happens in our daily life will be different, but we can experience it differently. So normally when we have afflictive thoughts and emotions, we immediately start that cascade we talked about earlier, that obsessive internal dialogue or commentaries that rev up the afflictive thoughts and feelings. But now that we have some experience with noticing when we've been triggered, or even just become aware that we are experiencing an afflictive thought or emotion, okay? If we can catch ourselves before we start to spin a dramatic story from what happened, just like we do in centering prayer with our thoughts, we can watch it come and watch it go. We just observe without commenting. So it's not about ignoring the thought or feeling, but we can look into it more deeply with a more detached attitude. So just notice it, observe it. Observe everything that we can about it. Where do we feel it in our body? Is anything else getting triggered? Where might it have come from? So we're just watching and not engaging, which gives us a better chance of letting it go, okay? So first we just let it be, then we let it go. And you might think this sounds similar to the welcoming prayer, but the value of a practice like watchfulness is that we can stop the roller coaster of emotions and commentaries before they really get going to a point where we need the welcoming prayer, okay? We may even start to realize that when we are the witness to what is happening, that we are already free of the affliction and the clinging, the attachment, okay? These next three practices are adapted. I adapted them from the work of Adyashanti. And these are very simple yet powerful practices because they tend to focus your attention and your intention. The first one is called pivoting towards peace. And it's a practice that can change the encounters that we have in daily life, including our relationships. So this is another awareness practice, and you can use it when you have an encounter with another person or even an encounter with your inner commentaries. So first think about what pivot means. It's about changing direction. So in a conversation or interaction, it can shift the direction or tone of the encounter. And so don't think of this as avoiding conflict. It's more about noticing the direction of a conversation. And if you're sensitive and paying attention, you'll notice there are points when you could make a choice and move the conversation in one direction or another. Notice how you're feeling. If you're getting agitated or things are getting heated, what would happen if you made a pivot towards peace? What would it be like to have a more peaceful relationship with your experience of others and how they're feeling? Okay. So just by posing the question at times during the day, options for choices about how we respond open for us. So it's not so much about pivoting towards peace with the other person. It's more about pivoting towards peace within myself in my experience of the person or the situation. Leading with the heart is about love. You can practice this first in your imagination. And you would do this just by closing your eyes and imagine walking towards you someone that you live with or work with, regardless of the status of your relationship at the moment. And just imagine opening your chest and exposing your heart. You're revealing your love and kindness, and this can feel very vulnerable. So notice how it feels as you do it in your imagination. Can you feel an energy shift when you lead with your heart? And then try doing it in real time with everyone that you encounter. Sense them with your heart first, not your head, and then let whatever happens happen next. Just notice if there is any difference in the experience and in how you feel. Sense your loving heart encountering each person. And notice if you feel some hesitation, some fear, resistance, anxiety, whatever you notice, just let it be. You may have a long pattern of protecting or closing off your heart. In this practice will help you realize how resilient your heart really is and what you may have been missing out on by keeping it closed. So if you're willing to take the risk and lead with your heart, notice if it changes how you interact with others. Is your approach, your tone, the words that you use different than they were before? And then seeking to understand, most of us prefer to be understood. It feels good to be understood. And we usually have an ego response when we feel understood, which then reinforces our desire to be understood. And, we can subtly, even unknowingly, be seeking to be understood. And that can block us in relationships and can leave us frustrated when it becomes an unconscious demand, like we were talking about with the false self. So seeking first to understand is quite different. We might seek first to understand ourselves, which will likely relieve us from the pressure of our desire to be understood, okay? It puts our attention on really listening to the other person in our effort to understand, putting our agenda aside. So this is an art, but it can also be a skill that we can learn. So to practice, you start by paying attention to what someone is saying, where they're coming from, what state of being they might be in, and where what they're saying is relevant and important to them. When someone feels heard and understood, it's a remarkable gift that we give them. And so you can just think about how this is in your own experience when you feel heard and understood, when you feel that someone has really been present to you and listened. I added spiritual companionship here as a simple act that we can do because even though our wisest counsel is our own inner wisdom, it can be difficult to hear it through all of our egocentric and false self filters. So saying it out loud to a trusted spiritual companion, whether it be a friend or a spiritual director, it can make us, it can help us to make sense out of what our inner wisdom has to say to us. So those are just a few other practices besides the ones we usually teach that can help us in daily life. And to finish this session on embracing darkness and how we can heal some of these things that we think of as troublesome, but that are also blocks on the path along the way to coming into the light of the transforming union. So now you can see how our contemplative practices can start to put some space in between these cogs. And so when there's space there, one doesn't set off the other or start the cascade. This is what can happen when we put intention into contemplative practices for daily life. And if we do some of these simple acts with intention and discipline, they don't fade from our consciousness, and you can see if they can help you stay in the present moment and bring that quietness and stillness into daily life. So I want to end our morning session, and I know I've gone over a little. I knew I would. But anyway, I want to end with this poem that I think sort of fits our some of what we've been talking about. It's called She Let Go. And it's kind of a long poem, so I'm going to ask you, I had Bob send you a copy of it so you can read it later. But I'm just going to read it slowly, and I would like you to just sit back and listen and just kind of let go of everything that we've already talked about, okay? And just be and listen. She let go. Without a thought or a word, she let go. She let go of the fear. She let go of the judgments. She let go of the confluence of opinions swarming around her head. She let go of the committee of indecision within her. She let go of all the right reasons, wholly and completely, without hesitation or worry. She just let go. She didn't ask anyone for advice. She didn't read a book on how to let go. She didn't search the scriptures. She just let go. She let go of all the memories that held her back. She let go of the anxiety that kept her from moving forward. She let go of the planning and all of the calculations about how to do it just right. She didn't promise to let go. She didn't journal about it. She didn't write the projected date in her day timer. She made no public announcement and put no ad in the paper. She didn't check the weather report or read her daily horoscope. She just let go. She didn't analyze whether she should let go. She didn't call her friends to discuss the matter. She didn't do a 5-step spiritual mind treatment. She didn't call the prayer line. She didn't utter one word. She just let go. No one around when it happened. There was no applause or congratulations. No one thanked her or praised her. No one noticed a thing. Like a leaf falling from a tree, she just let go. There was no effort. There was no struggle. It wasn't good and it wasn't bad. It was what it was, and it is just that. In the face of letting go, she let it all be. A small smile came over her face. A light breeze blew through her, and the sun and the moon shone forevermore. Amen. So, help me, facilitators, because I think we're at the point where we're supposed to take a break now. Katie, where are you?
Need to unmute. Um, we have a break coming up, and I think because it's been so rich, we say what's percolating and ask people to unmute and share. Um, that may be a bit much to expect of ourselves. This has been so rich, so open. Maybe we'll just sit with it right now and let it percolate in us. We'll take a break right now, which is so we're on schedule. We'll take a little 10-minute break. We'll start centering prayer at 11:15 and just let it percolate in us. And there will be time later in the day to share again after the afternoon session of Julie's presentation. But for me, I just want to marinate. I love that word, marinate, in what has been shared and let it be. So,
Thank you,
10-minute break.
Katie.
And Bob will stop record. Yes? Question?
No,
No.
I just said thank you, Katie.
Oh, thank you. Yep. So I'll ring the chime. We will break, and then we'll ring the chime to as we prepared to listen to Embracing Darkness. A light shines in the darkness.
Thanks, Katie. I love that. I love Nan Merrill's translation of the Psalms, and that Psalm, I think it was 43. It's a beautiful way, I think, to start talking about the dark night of the soul, because that really is a journey into love. So, as I hope we'll see. So I'm going to put the slides up here again. So this morning we started out with the passage from Genesis that starts with "in the beginning," and so now I want us to take a look at what John's gospel says at the beginning of his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. You know, throughout some of the things that I've struggled with in life, some of the things that we talked about this morning, this phrase, the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it, has really resonated with me and given me the courage to continue to follow wherever God was leading me, usually without knowing where. Again, into the mystery. For the most part, when we're going through a dark night of the soul, we don't know we're going through it. So it's always helpful to have something like a phrase from Scripture or an active prayer that we talked about this morning to encourage us to persevere. So I mentioned earlier that we often think of darkness as being something bad or sinister or sometimes even evil. But I really like the clarity that Gerald May offers in this quote. He says, "The dark night is an ongoing spiritual process in which we are liberated from attachments and compulsions and empowered to live and love more freely. Sometimes this letting go of old ways is painful, occasionally even devastating, but this is not why the night is called dark. The darkness of the night implies nothing sinister, only that the liberation takes place in hidden ways, beneath our knowledge and understanding. It happens mysteriously, in secret, and beyond our conscious control." One of the things that I like about Gerald May's book, The Dark Night of the Soul, if you're interested in any further reading about this, is he talks a little bit about that when John of the Cross used the Spanish word oscura, which means dark, but it also means having little or no light. It means dim or shadowy. It could mean unclear and confusing, okay? Even something that's difficult to understand. So if we think about the English word obscure, we might come closer to what John of the Cross really meant, which is unclear, uncertain, little known or hidden, okay? And as Gerald May said, it's also beyond our conscious control. So if you think about how difficult it can be to see at night, especially when it's new moon. I mean, right now we've got a full moon going on, so you can see pretty well if you're outside. But our deepest relationship with God is hidden from our conscious awareness. I think this is what the author of The Cloud of Unknowing is referring to as well. And I also think it's what Father Thomas means when he talks about we let go of our idea of God so we can experience God as God is. Because any concept or idea that we might have of God is not God. So the dark nights are mysterious and unknown, and they're beyond what we can even imagine. During the nights, God is purifying and liberating us from our attachments and bringing us to the realization of our true self. So we'll come to realize that our attachments that we talked about this morning and our false self motivations are not really what we desire. You know, remember what Father Thomas says so many times in his teaching, change the direction in which you're looking for happiness. So what we desire in our heart of hearts is the freedom to love not just God, but all of God's creation, including ourselves, right? Some refer to the dark night of the soul. I mean, I think this is more of like a modern interpretation of what it means to people, but they think of it as going through a time of suffering, of bad luck, of the loss of something or someone that they love, of a depression, something like that. Now, we may be experiencing some of these things and going through a dark night. But the dark night it's a loving, healing, and liberating process. It may not always feel good, but the sure sign of it is that we don't clearly know what is happening. We can probably tell that something is happening, but we don't know what it is. So May says that people often experience depression and a dark night at the same time because depression can often accompany loss and grief, if we're going through that. So think for a minute about what the word liberate means. It means to free, right? But sometimes when we're set free from something that's burdening us, it can feel like a loss, and we may grieve that loss. So even the letting go of aspects of our false self or our shadow can feel like a loss because it may be the only self that we know. So this can be one of the reasons that we avoid the whole idea of darkness. We'd really rather avoid what might cause us pain. But it is the purpose of the darkness. If we could really see what we were being asked to let go of, we would probably say no thank you. God darkens our awareness to protect us and keep us safe. And the darkness becomes what John of the Cross calls a guiding night. So we'll take a closer look at the dark nights. In the talk this morning, I mentioned that Teresa of Avila said that if we really want to know God, we have to start by knowing ourselves. And as the journey continues and our desire for this path grows, God is moving closer and showing us more and more of the debris that has accumulated on our path. And God wants to help us throw out the trash, so to speak. There are two nights that comprise the dark night of the soul. The first is the night of sense, followed by the night of spirit. And Father Thomas says that some people enter into the night of sense soon after they start a contemplative practice. As I was working on this presentation, I was thinking, what is the value to people of knowing about the dark night of the soul? Because I think that's a helpful place to start when you're going to talk about something like this. But when I thought about what Father Thomas says, that I would say probably most of us enter into it soon after we start a contemplative practice. And as we'll hear later on from Gerald May, it's something that continues on the spiritual journey as well. So anyway, there are signs that we may have entered into the night of sense. Although again, as Gerald May says, if we think we're in a dark night of the soul, we probably aren't, because these signs and experiences are so obscure and hidden. So the first sign is a diminishment of consolation in prayer, but also of any kind of gratification in our daily life. So, in other words, we feel a dryness or an aridity in both prayer and life. And it feels like a great loss, where we may have felt a very personal and enlivening relationship with God, we now feel nothing. And we will often try to redouble our efforts in spiritual practices, but it doesn't work anymore. So, maybe you can think of times in your life when you've experienced some of these things that we're talking about here. Also, any gratification we may have experienced from our emotional programs for happiness, they are an attempt to get some sort of gratification. Anyway, they provide no satisfaction anymore. The second sign is a fear that we're going backwards and that we have somehow offended God. Why else would God seemingly disappear? We're no longer getting any affirmation from God, and we may even think that our relationship has ended. But what's ended is our over dependence on our senses and reasoning in prayer. So we try to keep up our regular prayers more out of a sense of obligation or maybe habit, but we lose our desire to pray as we always have. But also, we lose our desire to live life with all the effort and fervor that we once had because we don't want to go back. We don't want the old ways anymore. The third sign is losing our desire for discursive meditation, what we may have become accustomed to in Lectio Divina, or any practice that includes thinking or praying with words, okay? When we sit in prayer, our mind wanders far and wide because we find no pleasure in the usual way of prayer. But at the same time, we have a deepening desire to be alone with God and simply love God, even though God seems to have lost interest in us. And we'll usually feel that we just don't know what to do or how to do it anymore, but we want to, okay? So John of the Cross says that all three of these signs are present together in the night of sense. And he says if you only have one and not the others, something else might be going on. And we could add what else might be going on is a depression or a grief of some kind. Father Thomas says that these trials, the three trials of the night of sense, are gifts because the Spirit puts the spotlight on the source of the problem. And these trials are not necessarily experienced by everyone, but if we have a prolonged experience of the night of sense, then we may experience all of them or some of them. And, the names of these trials I find interesting, but we'll give them a modern spin with the help of Gerald May. So the first trial is the spirit of fornication. And fornication is what today we might call premarital sex, but can also refer to immoral sexual activity. But in a broader sense, it implies a turning away from God to seek personal gratification. So the mind is really at this point in a desperate attempt to find gratification or pleasure anywhere. So it could be sex, it could be food, alcohol, or any other compulsive behavior that brings temporary satisfaction. In prayer, because of the dryness we're experiencing, we might be looking for the perfect meditation practice, religious community, or spiritual experience that gives us that consolation and love that we miss, that personal relationship we miss, but we'll eventually realize that no created thing can bring us the kind of satisfaction that we're seeking. The second trial is called the spirit of blasphemy. And this comes with an impulse to rage against God because of the continued absence of gratification that we experienced in the previous trial. Consolations are absent because we feel that God is absent and we think God has disappeared. But it's our concepts, images, and our sensations of God that we're no longer experiencing. And we must rid ourselves of these attachments. Again, our what Thomas calls our idea of God in order to experience God as God is. So a God who cannot be grasped or clung to, but this feels like abandonment or betrayal. Okay. The third trial is the spirit of dizziness. And we think that if we could only understand what's happening, we could do something to make it right. And again, we become desperate to figure out where we went wrong. We start this interior dialogue of maybe my problem is this, or maybe I should try this. We admonish ourselves for our lack of diligence in our practices. And we may start to read self-help books or go to workshops or try a different meditation practice, anything we can think of. And it all fails and we end up more confused than ever. So eventually we realize the only thing left to do is give up or surrender. And we come to rely on God alone. As I said a few minutes ago, the trials put the spotlight on the source of the problem, which is our selfishness, which is the core of each of the energy centers. Okay? We do what we can to dismantle the false self system, and then we surrender to God's mercy. And in the end, all we have to do is consent. God will take it from there. Now, while this is true, I say it somewhat facetiously because we're likely to resist consenting to some of what we've been talking about. But what's true, I mean, it is true that if we do consent, God really will take it from there. Both of the nights, both the night of sense and the night of spirit, have active nights and passive nights. So we'll first talk about the night of sense since we're still on the night of sense. In the active nights, people are aware of practicing in their own spiritual journey. Though we would usually be unaware that we're participating in the night of sense, we would be drawn to furthering the process because of promptings of the spirit. Okay, we may become more disciplined. We may practice restraint with our usual habits, which are usually overloading our senses with the things that bring us pleasure and gratification. But we would be moving towards simplifying rather than complicating, emptying instead of filling, letting go rather than accumulating. Okay, we can't free ourselves on our own, but we keep trying. And this is where the passive nights come in, as we realize that we need God's grace and mercy. And we may hear the old admonition, I'm sure you've all heard it a number of times, to let go and let God. And we really want to, but it doesn't happen until we've exhausted our own efforts. Even when we're relentless in our willfulness and may need to be brought to our knees, this is the place of surrender, right? So, try to remember our God is so generous that when we finally surrender, grace will flow through all our failures to let go and loosen up our willfulness. So we begin to realize that God is taking us where we wouldn't and couldn't go on our own. And this may be an either painful or joyful experience, depending on how much clinging or how liberating letting go feels, okay? The only thing we can say for sure is that it's an emptying process. So we'll ultimately feel lighter and freer, okay? These are the things that Father Thomas tells us are the fruits of the night of sense. So, however we thought our lives would go and whatever expectations we might have had for inner peace and an ability to love, we usually end up being frustrated by being triggered by afflictive thoughts and emotions, the commentaries. So this diminishes in the night of sense as we grow in trust with God and we release the energy that is bound up in the false self. So we now have the freedom to decide what to do and do it. I'm sorry, in the background you're hearing my dog getting a drink, but can't do anything about it. Okay, the second thing is humility. So these trials and experiences that we go through level the playing field so that we're able to live life as everyone else does. And all our problems and struggles and mistakes, they continue, but we know at our core we are good and we are loved. Now, Father Thomas says that the spiritual journey is not a success story, but it's a series of diminutions of self, and that humility, that the path to humility is through humiliation. Doesn't that sound like fun? The third thing is living under the influence of the unconscious takes a tremendous amount of energy. And when this energy is freed up, we become filled with divine energy so that loving God and serving others comes naturally and more easily and is less exhausting. The fourth is most of us don't realize the power of our cultural conditioning and how it influences our values and our conscience. The night of sense gives us the freedom and the courage to challenge the prepackaged values that we grew up with. And it opens us up to seeing reality in a new way, a way that fits who we are, okay? Where we once could not imagine not having a radio or TV or a podcast or be on one of our devices, we realize that God is coming closer and we start to crave silence and solitude so that we can better listen, okay? We experience a mysterious awakening, which feels like a breath of fresh air, and we don't know what has happened or how it happened. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes when we cover the restructuring of consciousness. Okay, the second night, John calls the night of spirit. And when the night of spirit begins, all felt experiences of God disappear. So for people who've experienced consolation in the early part of their journey, this can feel like a tremendous loss. Now, not everyone experiences consolations or that felt presence of God, but they may still feel a spiritual desolation. So let's listen to what Father Thomas says about the night of spirit. it's a further transitional stage involving a more intimate purification. We become aware that there are rough spots in the unconscious that have not been corrected by the night of sense, such as habitual distractedness of mind, the lingering effects of cultural conditioning, the spiritual pride. The night of spirit is designed to free us from the residue of the false self in the unconscious, and thus to prepare us for the transforming union. In a similar way to the night of sense, the night of spirit also has active nights and passive nights. So again, the active nights are when people are actively participating in their spiritual journey by exercising discipline and restraint and continuing with spiritual practices. With the night of sense, the purpose is to purify our senses. In the active night of spirit, it's the intellect, memory, and will that are being purified or emptied. And as the night of sense is about simplifying rather than complicating, same thing with the night of spirit. Also about relinquishing rather than accumulating, emptying instead of filling. So even though we're participating, we have this even stronger knowing that we cannot do it on our own. We may have a deep longing for God's grace and mercy. In the passive night of spirit, the process is happening in obscurity. Remember what we said about that. In other words, we do not understand that the changes are opening us to more free and complete love. Our reaction will often be self-doubt, that we're doing something wrong, that we should do something more. Okay? But we start to lose interest in some of the spiritual things that used to bring us gratification, while at the same time, we have less of a feeling of separation. So there's like an inner relaxation of what we've been clinging to, and it may take us a while to realize that something has eased up within. Okay? The habitual relationship that we've had with God over a lifetime starts to change. And this can be very painful. So, our idea of God no longer matches up with reality of our experience, which is more of a loss of the sense of God's presence, and we feel abandoned. But at the same time, we may experience a more generalized sense of presence and companionship everywhere. So it may feel like a less intimate personal relationship. And when this starts to happen, we know that it's time to let go of our attachment to our idea of God. If we consent, this can be a very liberating experience because we have not really lost anything, okay? We've consented to a more open ability to love. Father Thomas says that the night of spirit is an intensive course in humility. But there are fruits. And the first fruit, sometimes some of these may not seem like fruits, but stay with it. The first fruit is freedom from the temptation to assume a glamorous role because of our spiritual gifts or charisms. Now, this is really the basis of humility. The second fruit is freedom from the domination of any emotion. This truly is a gift. So previously, our lives were run by our reactions to emotions. That stops. We realize that we are not our emotions, but we will always have emotions. And we can develop a friendlier attitude towards our emotions. A third fruit is the purification of our idea of God. And, this is one of the remarkable gifts of the dark nights. We've gone through this experience of what we perceived as God's absence. But now that we've consented and surrendered, God reveals this infinite, incomprehensible, and ineffable presence. Can you hear Father Thomas saying those three things? Infinite, incomprehensible, ineffable. All we can really say is that an immense and unnameable energy is welling up inside, the divine energy. A fourth fruit is the purification of our idea of God. So we develop a disposition that's willing to accept God on God's own terms. And as a result, we allow God to be God without knowing who or what that is anymore. And that's okay with us. A fifth fruit of the night of spirit is the longing to be free of every obstacle that might hinder our growth in divine union. So this is kind of a big thing here, the longing to be free of every obstacle, because there usually are a lot of obstacles. So again, some things are happening that are difficult to describe. And John of the Cross called pure faith a ray of darkness. We no longer have the consolations that we used to rely on, so there's really nothing else we can do but simply trust in God's infinite mercy. We are infused with divine love. Again, something that we may or may not be able to feel, but just know and trust. We're being brought to the doorstep of divine union. I think sometimes in Father Thomas's teaching, it sounds as if we go through the dark night of the soul and that's it, that we've done it. But I think he would agree with Gerald May that almost everything about the spiritual journey is more like a spiral rather than linear that we talked about this morning. So May says, various dimensions of the night are always going on in our lives. God is always working obscurely within us. And even more mysteriously, some part of us is saying yes to God's invitations to go where we do not want to go. The dark night of the soul is not an event one passes through and gets beyond, but rather a deep, ongoing process that characterizes our spiritual life. In this sense, the dark night is a person's hidden life with God. Now, I asked you earlier, and you may already have been thinking of times in your life when you've experienced these dark nights. And where are you now? Are any of these things going on in your life now? Or have you recently been through an experience when you knew something was going on, but you didn't know what? But you can look back now and say, oh, that's what was happening. Now, this is Gerald May's way of talking about the fruits of going through the dark night of the soul, what Father Thomas calls the transforming union. May says we receive these three precious gifts. The first is that the soul's deepest desire is satisfied. So we're now freed from attachment to simply love with all of who we are in both our actions and our feelings. So the second is that the delusion of separation from God goes away. So we slowly start to realize that we have always been in union with God. And the third is that the freedom of love and realization of union leads to active participation in God. Now, what might active participation in God mean to you? May says that we recognize our own goodness and beauty, but we also share God's love and compassion for others and participate in some sort of service in the world, even if that's just loving the people that we live with. At this point, we start to realize that we never could have done this on our own. It's a miracle that it even happens as it does. And this is when we are co-creating and co-participating with God towards others and in the world. Gerald May says that the spiritual life is a journey of consciousness, that union with God is neither acquired nor received, that it's realized. And in that sense, it's something that we can long for and we can even seek, which I think most of us do. And with grace, we find. Okay. So he says in this quote, the dawn is the awakening to a deepening realization of who we really are in and with God and the world, and of what has been going on within us in the night. Always and most important, the dawn is an awakening in love. This love, divine in its nature, and glimpsed only through the gift of divine light, is the greatest of all mysteries. It is the one sheer gift of contemplation, completely unattainable by autonomous human effort. So this kind of love is beyond the grasp of our faculties that we've talked about in the night of sense and the night of spirit. Our senses, our intellect, our memory, and our will. It's greater than any emotion. It's always mysterious and it's difficult to describe. And yet May describes it so beautifully. It's not in this quote, but he says that love is the breath of the divine. So, I like that image because the breath is always with us, just as the divine is always with us. Love is always with us. So, having passed through the dark nights, the morning light reveals some things that are happening to us that we didn't really do anything to attain or achieve. So this is how May describes this. Although the love itself remains indescribable, the morning light does reveal some things that have been happening within us. One is growing in freedom, experienced as the energy of desire is liberated from the attachments that have kept it restrained. A second change is the classical transition from meditation to contemplation in prayer, and the equivalent metamorphosis of the soul from autonomous self-determination to self-giving willingness to be led. Now, I know those are all psychiatrist terms, but that it also says it, and I think it's beautiful. A third change is the awakening itself, the dawning realization of our essential union with God and all creation. John of the Cross says that this freedom and liberation we experience, we realize that our motivations are indistinguishable from God's. So I think that's a remarkable revelation. And another way of saying it is that our will and God's will are in alignment. And there's an interior peace when that happens. Now, here, Father Thomas gives us another way of looking at what May was referring to, things that are happening that we didn't do anything to attain or achieve. And when Father Thomas talks about the transforming union, he starts with what he calls the restructuring of consciousness. In fact, he says that transforming union is a restructuring of consciousness. So this is what he says in Open Mind, Open Heart. Not contemplative practice, but the contemplative state is the purpose of our practice. Not experiences, however exotic or reassuring, but the permanent and abiding awareness of God, which is the transforming union, that comes through the mysterious restructuring of consciousness. At some point in your life, it could be in the middle of the night, on a subway, or in the midst of prayer, the necessary changes in the nervous system and psyche finally come to completion. The restructuring of consciousness is the fruit of regular practice. Now, I think what's important in this is that something mysterious is happening to us when we have a regular practice of centering prayer and consent to this journey, not just spiritually, but physically and emotionally as well. So our physical brain is being changed, and in turn, our nervous system and psyche are being repaired, so to speak. So we are not the same as when we started this journey. These are some of the things that you'll start to notice over time that are changing. And we may not be able to put our finger on what changed and when, but at some point we start to notice that something is different. There's less inner turmoil and more interior silence. The commentaries start to quiet down. Emotional swings start to disappear or diminish. The emotions that we do experience are appropriate to the present moment. They're not triggered by some irrational reaction. We can serve others without getting caught up in their emotional pain. So we recognize the boundary between someone else's pain and our own emotions so that we can truly respond with compassion and empathy, setting our own agenda aside. We find it easier to let go of troubling thoughts and commentaries that often are not related to our present reality. You know, so often our mind tricks us into thinking some perception that we're having, surfaced from our unconscious is reality, when it's really just our perception. We are more sensitized to the ways of the divine presence, of the ways the divine presence manifests in our lives. We more readily perceive, consent, and respond to the divine presence in action within. So these are things we can't aspire to or do anything to make them happen. When we have a regular practice of centering prayer, as we said from the last slide, our brain, nervous system, and psyche are changed. And as Father Thomas says, it's a fruit of regular practice. I like that Father Thomas calls divine union transforming union, because I think transforming is something that is also ongoing in us. And so he starts here talking about it. The experience of the transforming union is a way of being in the world that enables us to live daily life with the invincible conviction of continuous union with God. As I said, Father Thomas says that transforming union is a restructuring of consciousness, not an experience or set of experiences. the presence of God is evident without our trying to find God in whatever that we're experiencing in life. It's that invincible conviction. He goes on to say this state of consciousness is not passing, but a permanent awareness that spontaneously envelops the whole of life. So what we go through in the dismantling of the false self through divine therapy and also the dark nights changes us, as does, I'm trying to think. All of the things that we talked about today, we have a part in it, a participation in it, but then there's also God working in the part that's restructuring our consciousness. So it's a new way of being in the world. Okay. Remember when in the restructuring of consciousness, when he called it a state, that's a new way of being in the world. He goes on here to say divine love can now manifest itself in all our activities, even the most ordinary. In the transforming union, the dominion of the emotions ceases. Those emotional swings disappear. It's not that we no longer have emotions, they'll be as strong as ever, but we're now able to respond rather than react in ways that are more appropriate to the present moment rather than fueled by the past. Life will continue to challenge us, go figure. But we now have that invincible conviction of God with us in whatever we're experiencing in life. As I've worked with Gerald May's understanding of the dark nights, I've realized how for him this whole journey leads to love. Nothing that he says is in opposition to Father Thomas's teaching, but I hear something different in his approach that I will continue to ponder. We often hear it said that God is love. So doesn't that also mean I am love? And then, I started thinking, is love a noun or a verb? And then for that matter, is God a noun or a verb? So this all just deepens the mystery for me, which is a place of more questions than answers. And I'm okay with that. But let's listen to what May says about this. Union with God already exists. Everyone always has been and always will be in union with God. This union is so deep and complete that seeking God must include self-knowledge, and self-knowledge must include the search for God. The soul arrives at perfect union with God through love. This deepening of love is the real purpose of the dark night of the soul. The dark night helps us become who we are created to be, lovers of God and one another. So that's the end of my comments on the darkness and the coming of the dawn. And I want to end again with another prayer of reflection. This is called the Prayer of the Empty Water Jar by Macrina Whitaker. And it's inspired by the story of the woman at the well, which is from John 4. So again, if you would just relax, take a breath, sit back, let go. Jesus, I come into the warmth of your presence, knowing that you are the very emptiness of God. I come before you holding the water jar of my life. Your eyes meet mine, and I know what I'd rather not know. I came to be filled, but I am already full. I am too full. This is my sickness. I am full of things that crowd out your healing presence. A holy knowing steals inside my heart, and I see the painful truth. I don't need more. I need less. I am too full. I am full of things that block out your golden grace. I am smothered by gods of my own creation. I am lost in the forest of my false self. I am full of my own opinions and narrow attitudes, full of fear, resentment, control, full of self-pity and arrogance. Slowly, this terrible truth pierces my heart. I am so full, there is no room for you. Contemplatively and with compassion, you ask me to reach into my water jar. One by one, Jesus, you enable me to lift out the things that are a hindrance to my wholeness. I take each one to my heart, and I hear you asking me, why is this so important to you? Like the murmur of a gentle stream, I hear you calling, let go, let go, let go. I pray with each obstacle, tasting the bitterness and grief it has caused me. Finally, I sit with my empty water jar. I hear you whisper, you have become a space for God. Now there is hope. Now you are ready to be a channel of life. You have given up your own agenda. There is nothing left but God. Amen. Okay, so I love the way Bob put on the agenda for this time, what's percolating? So what's percolating? And then we also have a question of what touched you today, that is part of this part of the and I'm just wondering if we can't combine those two things because you might have the same thing to say. What's percolating and what touched you today? And so you can just unmute yourself when you're ready and remember that there's 29 of us together today still. And so keep your comments brief, please.
I will go. This is Terry.
Yes, Terry.
Quickly, first of all, wow. Wow. I cannot believe that you've never done this before. This was so polished. The timing was beautiful. The content was so rich and deep. And what touched me and is percolating is how beautifully you touched our hearts and our heads. I love the poetry, and I love um, the Psalms, and I love the content that I've heard before, but I understand now in a deep way. And I'm going to be rewatching this. And um, thank you. Awesome day.
Thank you, Terry.
I'm wondering if this can be an intentional thing. My experience is it's all in God's timing to be called to that journey. Can this be an intentional thing?
Well, I think certainly some of it is intentional. And I don't know if you've watched the Spiritual Journey series. In the human condition part of it, Father Thomas talks about dismantling the false self system,
Uh-huh.
and he refers to it as we also have a part. So it's not just consenting; it's also, working on some of the things that we need to take a deeper look at. So yes, I think, and that some of the practices that I showed this morning are ways that you can be very intentional about certain things.
Mhm.
The dark nights, they're like the active nights, what John of the Cross said about that is that we are participating in some way. But are we doing it intentionally? Because we may not know that we're in a dark night. But I don't know. For me, I didn't pay that much attention to the dark nights in my earlier days of practice because I didn't really understand it. And I didn't want to at that point. It just seemed too mysterious to me. And then I started falling in love with mystery because isn't that what God is anyway? So I don't know. For me, it's helpful not so much to know when I'm going through a dark night, but I can look back now. Last year, I can remember that I knew that something was going on, and I did not know what it was, and I couldn't figure it out, and I just let it go. And I really think, as I look back on it, that I was going through a dark night. But see, that part of it is like I knew something was going on and I just kind of let it be. So maybe that's part of what we can do because, what primarily the way I interpret this, what John of the Cross is saying, what's going on is what God is doing. It's not what we're doing, right? So, yeah. Thank you, Jean.
Mhm.
I would like to witness what happened to me once on a 9-day retreat in Auburn, California. We were watching a Thomas Keating video, and he was talking about evacuation,
Mm.
that God evacuates stuff in our past or in our present. And I had tears running down my cheek. And I said, yes, yes, that happened.
Mhm.
And it was beautiful. I have no idea, night of since, I don't know what it was, but I can witness that it happened. And I'm so grateful.
Mm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. Anybody else? What touched you? What do you take away from this?
Maybe an angst, sensing the things that I see in front of me that I somehow glimpse from the talk that I know I need to let go of, but I don't want to. But there's a lot of swirling, and so I think it's just to be okay with the uneasiness and uncomfortableness of that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh, Jim, you froze. There you came back, but I don't know that we heard the last of what you were saying, other than the uneasiness and discomfort. And yeah, I mean, if you can allow yourself to just stay with that and not try to make it go away, you'll get through it.
yeah, just trust in the process, slow and steady, but and seeking that.
I love your image of the spiral, the ebb and flow of divine therapy um, as we go through the process, and it's never going to end.
Mhm.
But accept it.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Yeah, that's Thomas Keating's teaching, not mine. But I like to use it.
I don't know if I can put into words what I'm thinking adequately, but let me try. Um, Doing centering prayer, and I've been doing it for some time on and off. And despite the offness period of it, I can identify with changes that you've described. So I think, in a way, well, I think we all would agree God has a sense of humor. And I think that this will happen if we don't really try to do it so hard. If we just have the practice and go along with it and be humiliated when it happens and just let it happen. And what we would say, what you're describing, if I were to put a word on it, the outcome would be a successful outcome, but success isn't a word that we want to use, I don't think. But the success happens without our intent or effort many times. So it's in some ways like God getting the last words, saying, okay, gotcha.
Thanks, Karen. Father Thomas said to a friend of mine one time, this is, I think, just a classic Thomas Keating phrase. What's required is not more effort, but more consent. Isn't that great? Thanks, Karen.
So one of the words that I wrote down was consent. So Julie, since you just said the word consent, I'll go next. And I this kind of related to somebody else's comment earlier. I really believe and live by the idea that our consent is necessary. That's our active part. That God is not going to,
Mhm.
that we have to invite the Holy Spirit. That I think that's been my experience and the experience of a lot of people I know, that we have to invite the Holy Spirit. God will not like take over without our wanting it, I guess is a way of saying it. Um, I particularly resonated with the part from this morning about responsibility. And maybe a word connected with that is realizing and accepting that we are not victims, or sometimes people might try to make us victims, or we experience that people have tried to make us victims. But when we take responsibility for, I forget what you said it was, our emotions or our reactions or something,
Mm.
that forgiveness is involved with that. And that to me has been probably the most life transforming part of my spirituality
Mm,
is the forgiveness part.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Janet. Yeah.
I see that Mary Ellen had a hand
Oh, I
raised.
did. Couple of things I was thinking, and I'm sure some of this is because many of us were raised by Father Vinny. Um, but I think two things that I was thinking of is first of all that the God who we're waiting for is the God who's already present. And the other thing that has come to mean a lot to me is that God always wants what is best for us.
Mm,
We go through the whole process of the ups and the downs, the goodness and not so good, and all of that. But God is already here and He wants what is best for us.
mhm. Yes, beautiful. Thank you, Mary Ellen.
Julie, I'd just like to say that one thing about this divine therapy that I've, because of what you said, realized is that when we struggle and then return to the struggle, sometimes over and over again, each time it gets a little easier, I think, because we have changed.
Mhm,
And so, anyway, I thank you for bringing that up.
mhm. Okay, you're welcome. Thanks, Tom. So we still have about 5 minutes if anybody else has anything.
I'll go. I'll share a little
Jerry.
uh, personal um, situation as a bubbling up, what's bubbling up. As I listened to you, and I too want to say it was a very good presentation. Your slides were excellent. The visuals were very good,
Mhm,
and they supported what you were presenting. And as a result, the impact led me to recently, I say recently, last several months, I've been having those 3 o'clock in the morning visits um, where out of the clear blue, the mind wakes up and says, whatever racing thought is at the moment seems to be happening. And I would use, in order to return to sleep, sometimes I get up and just sit and just sometimes I use the welcoming prayer. Sometimes I'll use um, some other type of prayer, repetitive prayer, in order to slow down the cycling of whatever's in my mind. And I don't know why it's there. It just appears. So as you were describing some of the elements of the dark night, I've been, in fact, this is the Advent is the beginning of my centering prayer practice, and it started 7 years ago, just entering my 8th year, and I've dealt with or thought about the dark night of the sense, and and really tried to be honest. Have I experienced this? And before I got into centering prayer, I was in 12-step program for 40 some years, and a lot of what you talked about were elements of my 12-step spirituality, and which is quite honestly, centering prayer has has really filled a void that I had in that practice that I wish I would have had when I was 30 years old, but so be it. So as I sit here today, I'm going, well, whatever the dark night process is, I don't want to try to analyze it to death.
Mm.
That's my that's my modus operandi. And to experience it in the body, because I know there's some changes going on in my physical body. How much of that is the aging and diminishment process, and how much of it is just changes that the divine therapist, because I know my neural network is changing. Now, I hope it's from the divine therapist and not from the fact that I'm watching YouTube videos on spirituality, uh, because one never knows. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you. And I, I participated in the Living Flame program, and this presentation today was really an excellent uh, version that I could internalize. So thank you again.
You're welcome, Jerry. Yeah, thank you. And I love that you brought up that, you're not the only one that overanalyzes stuff. A lot of us, we think if we understand it, somehow we can own it. I don't know what, I don't know what that is, but yeah, just this is where I kind of try to embrace the mystery. I don't need to understand it. Yeah.
Could I come back again, please?
Sure.
I have to do this. I have to say this, that I've been through this dark night about 30 or 40 years ago. But, and I want you to know that I also accompanied that transition time with seeing a regular therapist so that make sure that I was okay. But I just want to tell you that I've been through it, and it's 1,000 times better than you could explain on paper or anything, to ultimately get to the place where we can love God. The reason I wanted to talk, I just wanted to say, I want everybody to know that it is so worth it. It can be very distressing, very, very distressing, changing and letting go. I had a terrible youth. I had it really complicated. And, but it can be, letting go of old patterns and old ways that are destructive and that are not of God. And, but like I said, I made sure I was accompanied by also a regular doctor. But I want to say it's great. It's 1,000 times better than you can put on paper. If you get the chance to do it, do it. And love with God is great. It changed my whole life. I'm nobody, and now I'm set up to do this job. I've been employed and invited to be employed by, these people, and just it's incredible what God has done with my life. And it never left me. After I had to change, I still have it. And I'm still doing centering prayer, but it's so beautiful. It's really great.
Mm. Such enthusiasm. Thank you, Jean.
Changes everything forever. I mean,
Anne, were you going to say something? Oh, no. Okay. So I think we're about at our time for the announcements and concluding prayer. Who's doing that? Katie?
Yes, I am. Someone's putting do we want the announcements up again? Bob's
Bob's
doing
working
that.
on it.
Bob's working on it. We are Contemplative Outreach of Columbus is going to offer a 9-day intensive retreat in Cleveland, Ohio at the Jesuit Retreat Center. And I will put in a plug for 9-day retreats. I've been doing them now for 4 years since my husband died, and I couldn't do it before, but it's just incomprehensible what happens when we allow God an extended period of time to be in silence with someone else cooking the meals and taking care of basic needs. I think they're wonderful. So if you're interested in that and knowing more, then contact Bob Gorman. We'll also have a Silent Saturday with Father Bill Sheehan, who has been immersed in Thomas Keating's world since 1983. He was part of the original group of people that gathered in Taos, New Mexico to experience what happens to ordinary humans when they're in silence together in centering prayer. So that will be February 21st. Again, the same kind of format as we have here, 8:30 to 2:30, with centering prayer and Lectio and Father Bill's presentations. And if you care to make a non-deductible donation to Contemplative Outreach of Columbus, then make checks payable to Tom Davis, or Terry has offered her Venmo account. They could be sent to Terry. So, Holy God, I'm just full of thankfulness today that you gathered this group of people morning and afternoon to immerse ourselves into your world, into your invitation offered through centering prayer and Lectio and Julie's beautiful slides and presentation, that you care enough about us to expose us to these measures of love, that you open to us, you open our hearts, you open our ears. We hear your gospel in a new way, where he says, put your light on a lampstand and be the light that you are, because you listen with new ears, you see with new eyes, you open your heart to new ways of being. Thank you. Thank you for this day, for this community, for all your gifts to us. Amen. Thank you all for coming. I'll see some of you maybe on February 21st, and others of you. We have, Tom can send you, if you're interested, Tom Davis or Bob Gorman can send you the schedule. We have centering prayer on Zoom at 8 different times during the week, and we have centering prayer in person at St. Josephine Bakita Church in the Northland area every Thursday evening from 5:30 to 6:30. So you're more than welcome to join us, either both. And if you happen to live close to Bob, there are centering prayer groups in Chicago. There are certainly lots in Denver. And nurture your soul by staying in touch. It's wonderful to do it privately, and also there's a special grace when you join with community to do it either on Zoom or in person. So stay in community with us in one way or another. Any questions? Any comments?